Hi Laura, thank you for letting us come and see you today in your office. Please can we just begin with you just explaining briefly what ClientEarth is and does. Can you give us a couple of recent examples of where you've had a kind of legal victory or win and why you see that as a win?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's quite a lot there. So ClientEarth is a legal environmental non-profit. We've got 300 people globally, and we work across the full life cycle of the law, essentially using the law to try and accelerate climate and environmental action and get to those positive tipping points faster. So that means we work on what are the right laws that you need, because if you get the right laws in place, you change the rules of the game. We support governments with drafting climate legislation. We work on regulatory reform for the energy transition, for example. So we strengthen the laws. We litigate to hold governments and corporates to account for what they're doing to try and change mindsets, shift, accelerate action there. And we also do what we call build the field. So we work with lots of partners globally. We train judges, lawyers, prosecutors, work with community groups so that they're also using the law to defend the environment and uphold their rights. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot of advocacy as well. But of course, it's normally our big piece litigation that hits the headlines. And you asked for a few examples there. Just in most recently, I think a really lovely example is a case that we brought and we supported in Spain, community groups who were suffering from the extreme pollution caused by industrial pig and poultry farming that was affecting their human rights. It was polluting their water, polluting their air. People were getting really ill. And we brought this case in Galicia in Spain, and the court ruled that a clean and healthy environment is interdependent with human rights and ordered the authorities to take action to ensure the pollution was cleaned up, to pay compensation to those citizens. And it's cases like that that are important both in terms of how the experience of those communities, so those communities who are living there on the front line of the impacts, but they're also important in terms of the precedent that it sets, because that's a court saying very, very clearly that there is a human rights obligation on authorities to take action on environment, a clean and healthy environment, which includes, of course, tackling climate change, stopping pollution, is critical for human health and human rights. So that's one example. I can give more if you want.
Well, there's a very notable kind of case that many of our audience would have heard about earlier in the summer, which is the International Court of Justice, which made headlines kind of around the world when it issued this landmark kind of advisory opinion on climate change. In practice, though, how does that actually change things? For example, in terms of reparations, the opinion talks about a need to establish a, quote, sufficiently direct and certain causal nexus linking a wrongful act to climate damages. So how might that actually play out and be achieved? In practical terms, in your work, for example, how does something like the ICJ opinion change or move the dial?
So the ICJ opinion is hugely important. It's a hugely important and authoritative articulation of what states' obligations are on climate change under international law. So that's hugely relevant for any courts in any country when they're hearing litigation. This decision will be on their tables, right, on their desks. They will be having regard to it because it sets out very clearly that states have an obligation under international law to take action on climate change. They need to regulate companies. That countries that are historic emitters have a greater responsibility. So it's hugely important in terms of really understanding what do states need to do. It doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. It is an advisory opinion. It's a decision of the highest court in the world. But it is authoritative in terms of cases that are brought at the national level, at the regional level, in regional bodies, for example. And it's also really useful in terms of really putting the pressure on states. It's an advocacy tool in the run-up to big events like COP30 in Belém, the climate change conference. you ask about, how would it work in terms of damages claims, for example? Well, under international law, there's a long-established principle of transboundary harm, for example, so that could come into play there. I think it's still quite hard to really draw a direct line from the ICJ advisory opinion to, right, now you're absolutely going to have damages claims from climate vulnerable countries against big emitting countries, but it strengthens the arm of those communities that are calling for action. It strengthens climate litigation, and will absolutely, open the door to even more litigation on this front.
Okay, thank you. Where do you stand on the strategic use of, as some choose to characterize it, lawfare, as a campaigning and legal strategy amid all the current geopolitical headwinds at the moment? Populist politicians and their media allies are kind of working hard, it seems, to paint lawyers and judges as elitists who are using courts to frustrate and block the will of the people, as they describe it. I'm particularly thinking of the US, where the rule of law and climate legislation are both under intense political attack. So where do you stand on this, the strategic use of what people are calling lawfare? So
I think it's more important now than ever when you have these really challenging political winds, geopolitical winds, when you have this political polarization, an attempt to say, well, if you care about environmental issues, that inevitably puts you in a certain political bracket. I think the law is critically important in lifting up from that sort of polarization. It's not political to want to breathe clean air. It's not political to want to drink clean water, or or ensure that your children have a safe and livable climate. And so, I think if the law used in the right way can really help build agency and build public buy-in for environmental action. So we have a number of cases, clean air cases with the local communities, the pig farming pollution case that I talked about, a case on zombie oil wells in Colorado, which are designed to increase the number of people who feel like they're getting their arms around these things and using the law to achieve better outcomes. So I think that's one thing. It's not a matter of politics. It's a matter of actually what are people's needs and rights, and how do we use the law to achieve those. I think the other thing is that, regardless of what's happening with politics, if you get something in law, in legislation, that builds in a longer term time horizon, which can insulate a little bit from the politics of the day. So that's really important. It is getting more heated, particularly in the States, but not only. You're seeing also strategic litigation from organizations like us that are trying to get progressive environmental outcomes from their work, but you're also getting your big slap suits, so strategic litigation against public participation. The most famous one recently, of course, being energy transfer against Greenpeace in the US, calling for $660 million in terms of costs. So that sort of thing is on the increase. That's always, top right of our risk register is, that idea that those that are seeking to delay the transition or stop the transition will see us as a threat and will come after us with some sort of defamation. So
you need to go toe to toe with those kind of legal way that the kind of opposition, some might say, are kind of using law or undermining the law, or however their tactics play out. You need to step up and go into that fight, as opposed to not being sucked into that. I'm just intrigued about the strategy.
So what's the strategy for dealing with this sort of lawfare from big oil companies, say? It's about being incredibly careful. That's, the first thing. And so we've done a lot as ClientEarth, but in the environmental movement on saying, how do you defend against SLAPP suits? What does the proper due diligence look like? But also there's important measures in place on anti-SLAPP legislation, which is really important to defend, because it is a very aggressive tool, and the chill effect can be enormous, and it's hugely anti-democratic. So I think it's about not stopping, this work and to push for a clean and healthy environment, to defend planet and people, but it's about doing it in a very careful way and always being alert to the risks.
So more broadly, in terms of sort of international law, if you like, amid kind of an era of kind of war crimes and human rights abuses in Gaza, Ukraine, beyond, etc., many have expressed a loss of faith in the potency of international law. What could this mean specifically for global climate treaties and the sort of multilateral cooperation required to tackle a global commons challenge such as climate change?
So look, I think there's no getting away from the fact that the world is a really scary place right now. It's very uncertain. Geopolitics are really tough. Multilateralism is under strain. But I think that doesn't mean that you give up. There's no space, there's no time for defeatism. And it's about how do we work through different multilateral channels to drive the work necessary. COP in Belém is going to be critically important. Huge amount of work going into that, saying, this is about implementation, doing what we said we'd do. Countries need to be coming forward with their new nationally determined contributions. And yes, some countries will step away. The US, of course, has left the Paris Agreement, but that doesn't mean that cooperation at multilateral level stops. We need to find different ways of enhancing it. And at the same time, alongside all that diplomacy and multilateralism, you've got what's happening in the economy, right? You've got the renewable revolution absolutely, scaling exponentially. You've got countries seeing that this is the way to secure growth, but also national security, resilience, and, a cleaner healthier way of life for citizens. So there is a lot of that real world action being taken. And, you see it, for example, in China, that is, way ahead in terms of renewable tech, for example, absolutely seeing the economic advantage, the advantage for its citizens, and the geopolitical advantage as well. So, I think progress can often go in fits and starts, and it's about, working out which channel, you've got to sort of keep pushing on every front, but some will sometimes be more fruitful than others.
So changing gear a little bit, I'm interested in the sort of the evidence base that the lawyers in your organisation will work with and take into court. And attribution science is a growing academic field, with climate scientists increasingly exploring the causal and probabilistic links between the numerous impacts, health, economic issues included in that, of extreme weather events. There's been a push to attribute even extreme weather to corporate emissions as well. So how might advances in attribution science sort of shape climate litigation going forward? It's
a really interesting developing frontier in climate litigation, really interesting. And you will know about the case that was just earlier this year, Luya versus RWE in Germany. This is the Peruvian farmer who took a case against RWE, the German energy company, essentially saying that his farm was at risk from glaciers melting as a result of climate change. So it was really, a very, very interesting attribution science claim. Now, the court confirmed that corporates, businesses, can be held liable for their emissions. So that's a hugely important precedent. It didn't actually rule that Luya was entitled to compensation, because it didn't find on that front. But that's really important. And as you say, attribution science, there was a really interesting article on it in Nature just a couple of months back. Attribution science has come on so far in your ability to say, well, this is what's happening in terms of climate impacts, this is how it connects to emissions, and it is only a matter of time before you get successful cases that show this extreme weather event or this sea level rise or, this temperature rise is directly attributable, in proportions to the emissions of this company, because particularly these big fossil fuel companies, they are collectively, I think Saudi Aramco as one company, if its emissions were a country, it'd be the sort of fourth biggest country in the world. So there's a huge amount there. Why is that exciting in the real world? Because then you open a greater prospect for class actions, for damages cases against these big emitters. And when those really, really scale, you're saying actually, fossil fuel company A is responsible for all this damage that's been done to our way of life, to our community, to our economy. When those damages claims scale, those really, really change the calculations and the business model of those companies.
I'm interested in the time scale of that, and also the actual taking that science into court. Where in terms of the robustness of the science, if you like, in terms of a lawyer presenting it as evidence in a court case, you said you suggested we're moving towards that. Can you give a sense of time? Is that many years away before you anticipate that, or are some territories and countries with their legal systems probably more likely to sort of accept that kind of evidence, and in terms of a kind of a legal victory downstream of that?
So, I'm not a scientist, but I think these are cases that lots of people will be thinking about now, and with that very close collaboration between the science community and the legal community. And as with any sort of new frontier, if you like, in terms of legal environmental activism, climate litigation, there will be cases that are attempted and that don't win, and then some that will. And of course, judges will require a very, very high evidentiary burden, looking at that attribution. But I think it's a promising and interesting area.
More widely, where is climate litigation going in the years ahead? How is it going to evolve? What are your sort of predictions or thoughts on that?
A lot. So there's a lot. I think there's a lot to talk about here. I think climate litigation in terms of, fossil fuels is very well established. What's next? We'll see a lot more on big food. There's the spotlight shifting to big food, both in terms of, these massive food companies who have these huge supply chains. And that's a question of emissions. It's also a question of environmental degradation, deforestation, human rights abuses. So I think that's one to look out for. We'll see even more human rights cases, on, for example, extreme heat. I think that's, going to be increasing as we sort of have we're in the era of climate consequences, right? We're already seeing places becoming hard to live in. So there will be extreme heat human rights cases. We'll see increasing cases around the petrochemicals industry and what that does to human health. And I sometimes talk also, we've talked about attribution science, I sometimes talk about the under-the-radar enablers of the status quo, right? So you can't build a new oil pipeline without the insurance, without the management consultancy, without the legal contracting, without the, advertising companies. And so I think it's really important that these professional services companies really look to what they're responsible for.
So you think it sounds like you're saying that it's these companies and corporates that are potentially more liable and open to legal kind of cases against them, as opposed to countries.
So I think
both,
actually. I think both. But I think in countries you have to you have to pick quite carefully to avoid unintended consequences or impacts. But I think I think the human rights angle at the country and government level is very powerful, because I think it's very well understood in governments that you have to look after your citizens, and actually if you're not protecting them from very severe climate impacts, you're not doing your job. So I think we'll see more of those human rights cases directed at the obligations of states, but then a lot also on corporates and what corporates need to do, and trying to fix lots of the real, absolutely egregious practices that are underway. We've got a really, really exciting case live in the US at the moment, which is about unplugged oil and gas wells. Now, there are 2.1 million unplugged oil and gas wells across the US. And the reason for that is because the fossil fuel company owns the oil well, makes all the profit, but towards the end of its life, sells that oil well on to a shell company. And at the point when the oil well needs to be plugged, made safe, the area around it remediated, that shell company goes bust, right? And so essentially, big oil are evading what are called their asset retirement obligations through very complex bankruptcy and fraud. And so, we are bringing a case which is designed on behalf of Colorado landowners who often are faced with the impacts and the costs of this pollution. And our case is really designed to shift that accountability. So really making a reality of the polluter pays principle, saying actually it's not okay to put private profit at the expense of public good. And your business model will be very, very different if you actually have to account for the damage that you're doing environmentally, for asset retirement obligations, all these things. And that will actually shift how the economics of it work, and that will help accelerate the transition.
And also presumably easier to win over public sympathy for a case like that. Absolutely. If you're dealing with local pollution, even if you're like a sort of Trojan horse for a wider atmospheric pollution issue, it's actually the local impact. It's very
local. And what happens is when big oil evades its asset retirement obligations, that lands on the local authorities, on the taxpayer, on the local landowners. And we're talking about massive methane leaks. We're talking about, poisoning of the local land, kids getting ill. It's a very, very real issue. And, and actually it sort of points also to a really interesting point about the leverage of successful climate litigation. So the costs to the US of these unplugged oil and gas wells is estimated to be 1.5 billion in terms of the climate impacts, the health impacts, the pollution, the cost of cleaning it up. And if we succeed in shifting the accountability for just 10% of those oil and gas wells, then that's $150 million saved, right? And our case costs $1.5 million. So it's a bit of, there's a bit of maths there, but the point is, if you can shift through corporate law, shift some of these corporate practices that are totally, unjust, then you're really getting to a point where the playing field is more level between the, fossil fuels of the past and the energy of the future.
Talking of corporates, we're sort of in this era of ESG backlash, and it feels like we've gone in recent years from a sort of dynamic of greenwashing amongst corporates to green kind of hushing. And how is that all affecting your work at ClientEarth, that sort of shift and backlash against ESG?
So I think, what's important to hold on to, whatever the political weather, whether ESG is in or out, what doesn't change, a bit like gravity, is the materiality of climate risk, right? What will climate change mean for your business, for your operations, for your bottom line? What is your long-term commercial viability? And there's a amazing open letter written in March by people representing 50% of the UK's food industry talking about the materiality of climate risk and biodiversity risk for the food industry at large. It's a huge issue for companies everywhere, and sometimes they might be doing less in terms of the PR and posturing around it, but any company that is thinking seriously about its long-term commercial viability is thinking about climate and biodiversity risk. They're putting steps in place, and they should also be advocating for the right regulation so that it is a level playing field.
ClientEarth operates in a variety of countries. How does ClientEarth interact with environmental law enforcement in countries with more closed judicial systems, such as China?
Yeah, we work very differently in different places. And that's really important. So in Europe, we do lots of litigation, advocacy. In China, it's a very different model. We're there at the invitation of the Supreme Court of China. We've been there for a long time now, and we've been training environmental judges in environmental law, because it's not enough to have the right laws in place. You need to make sure that those are enforced. And we've also been supporting the Supreme People's Procuratorate in developing public interest environmental litigation. So we're not doing the litigation ourselves, but we're bringing our expertise from the rest of the world to support them. And, actually the results are really quite amazing in terms of the number of cases that have been brought now by public interest litigators in China, focused on pollution, cleaning up the rivers, cleaning up air pollution, tackling, most recently we supported a case on mist nets that trap birds, so mist nets that are used in agriculture and that trap and kill birds. So it's a very different way of working. We work very much in collaboratively with the authorities, with the permission of the authorities, the invitation of the authorities, having really, really significant impact. And, another thing we did was provided advice on no longer financing coal in the Belt and Road Initiative. And that was a decision that went all the way up through the authorities and then was implemented. And so the avoided emissions, avoided fossil fuel infrastructure from that is important too. So it's all about working out where can we have the greatest impact, where do we need to be, and how do we need to work in that context to get the greatest return for the planet.
I suspect not everyone knows this about ClientEarth, but in 2019, before your time as CEO, admittedly, Pink Floyd's David Gilmour kind of famously auctioned off some of his guitars and gave all the proceeds to support your work. I think it was reported at the time that it was raised something like $21 million or something incredible. So how has that gift been used? I mean, that's probably and did massively transform the finances and opportunities for ClientEarth. But how does that actually downstream sort of trickle into your work?
It's been hugely important, and it was the most amazing gift from David Gilmour that has enabled us to scale what we do, to expand internationally. So we now have a much larger presence in China. We've opened a programmatic office in the US. We've been able to build our teams here, but also build our capability around our communications, our fundraising, for example. So it's just strengthened us as an organization. But importantly also, we've used it to really develop our ability to innovate and to bring really, really exciting test cases. So hugely, hugely important. It's led to a sort of very rapid growth, which has its, sometimes brings problems, but it's been hugely valuable in terms of the impact that we can have.
I mean, you personally have a very interesting CV with time deployed as a diplomat, kind of across lots of locations, with a variety of environmental impact, notably from climate change, which must have been apparent to you in your role at those times. How have those experiences shaped your current role at ClientEarth and your sort of thinking in your role?
I loved being a diplomat, and I often say that diplomacy at its best, it's about the art of the possible. How do you build connection? How do you understand other people? How do you collaborate to affect change? And, I really think about this work as the art of the possible. Yes, sometimes we carry a big stick of litigation, but it's always about thinking creatively, where, if we use the law at the right place, at the right time, how can we get to these positive tipping points fast, accelerate the change we need? And I think what I bring is that sense of, how do we collaborate? How can we be creative and use the law in a creative way? But importantly, how do we build those friendships, networks, influence, because none of this, this is all a team sport, right? These problems that we face are so all-encompassing. The law plays one part, but it has to be, with business, with government, with science, with the arts and culture, the hearts and mind piece. And so how do we all come at these issues collectively, but from different angles, to really try and drive the change that's needed?
I think you'll be able to list all your postings, but you've got experience in Oceania, Asia, Africa, wherever, all over the planet. In terms of those climate impacts, can you remember occasions or locations where it's almost been like a sort of an epiphany moment? You've seen, real impacts there.
Yeah, and it's always been a huge focus for me, but it was when I was in New Zealand. I was High Commissioner to New Zealand and High Commissioner to Samoa and Governor of the Pitcairn Islands. And when you spend a lot of time in the South Pacific and you go to these small island developing states, and I didn't just go to Samoa, I traveled all around the Pacific in my role, climate change there is existential. They've got no time for culture wars, but, is it happening? Is it not? It is an existential day and a day-to-day lived reality. And, whether that's about sea level rise, whether it's, about their economy, whether it's a loss of livelihoods. And so that for me made me want to work on these issues full time. But I also saw from, my role as governor of Pitcairn, I saw the impact of plastic pollution. So Henderson Island in Pitcairn is one of the most plastic polluted territories in the world, even though it's uninhabited. And we did a lot of work there to clean up the plastic, study its impact on the natural environment, communicate that to the world. And then on the other side, on the more positive side, Pitcairn has got a massive marine protected area. And we did a lot of science expeditions studying what the effect is of that marine protected area on the health of the oceans and marine life there, which was really, really inspiring. And so I sort of came, thinking holistically about these issues, the art of the possible, but it's not just about climate, it's about everything. It's about how we live our lives, how businesses operate, how governments think. How do we get away from that short-term thinking to thinking in a longer intergenerational sort of way is really important.
So final question, as we head towards COP30, I'm intrigued in two things, kind of what ClientEarth's sort of role will be at COP30, but also how do you think Brazil's domestic politics might affect the outcome? I'm thinking particularly of the dynamics behind Brazil's Devastation bill, which I believe ClientEarth has been actively focused on.
Look, I think it's really, really challenging to have those dynamics domestically, and Lula did veto or amended that bill, but he amended the most devastating elements of it. But clearly the politics there is really hard. You're seeing, a lot in terms of new permits being issued for oil and gas extraction. So that's really hard. It hampers a presidency. It's not the first time, of course, that a presidency has been, holding multiple truths in its hands at the same time. That importance of international climate coordination, and then the sort of messy domestic politics. But it's really critical at this COP30 that we do see countries come together with ambition and not just putting forward new nationally determined contributions, but really having a plan for what that looks like in the real world. You know, it's one thing to make a commitment internationally; it's another thing to turn that into into real world changes. And ClientEarth has been advocating, along with Globe legislators and WWF, for a new next generation of climate laws, because that's really how you close that gap between the international commitment and the real world change, and how you provide certainty, predictability for businesses, for all of the economy. And so we've supported a number of countries on their climate laws. We're advocating for other countries to adopt next generation climate laws to really, make a reality of those international commitments.
Is there a particular country where you think that effort is most needed on a climate law? Can you think of?
There are a number, and when we're seeing, and I mean, for example, Turkey recently, agreed its first ever climate law, but there are others where it would be hugely beneficial, where there are still no climate laws, and others where it needs updating. So, yeah.
Okay, Laura, thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure.
To
It's been really nice to talk to you. Thanks a lot. Yeah,
thank you.
Great.